Hello, my name is Doug Cram, the Extension Forest and Fire Specialist here at New Mexico State University. Our webinar today in our Learning to Live with Fire series is Proactive Steps to Safeguard Your Farm and Ranch. As always, I'd like to recognize my colleagues Suzanne DeVos Cole and Sid Gordon, the agents in Mora and Otero counties. This is an extension webinar where we have been providing the people of New Mexico with practical research-based knowledge and programs to improve the quality of their life for over 100 years. We are fortunate in New Mexico that all 33 counties have an extension office and extension agent, so don't be afraid to look them up to meet all of your extension needs. So how did we get here? Well, first of all, we live on a fire planet, and beyond that, we live in a fire continent, and a fire region, and a fire state. This map helps us show that indeed, fire is a part of our system. For over 100 years, we've been suppressing fire and excluding fire, two management decisions. When you add in people and homes, particularly in an arid environment as New Mexico and mix in climate with some drought, you have all the recipes for a wildland fire disaster. And from a farm and ranch standpoint, historically, firefighters sometimes caught wildland fires when they came out of the forest and maybe into the woodlands. But in drought situations, that is really no longer possible. Here we see fire behavior in the pinon juniper during the Cerro Grande fire. Likewise, in rural situations, riparian areas aren't necessarily much better, certainly not the bosque. This is from the Ironworks fire outside of Belen. Started over here, moved into the bosque, easily jumped the river, and continued on. You can get some pretty extreme fire behavior in the bosque. Likewise, in rangelands, this is outside of Portales and Floyd in spring 2019. Roads tend to be about 30 feet wide, so here we have at least 20-foot flame lengths in a grass brushland situation. I included this slide to remind us how these forest fires in particular tend to move across the landscape. It's not necessarily this wall of flames, but rather all these red islands here are as a result of firebrands being blown out in front of the fire, starting little fires to become big fires. This is the challenge of living in a wildland urban interface or in rural environments. I included this slide to remind us that just because you live out on a farm and ranch, trying to stop a wildland fire with a garden hose is not going to be safe or effective. You'll have to deal with intense heat, smoke, and flames. To further make that point, we have this interesting dichotomy in terms of natural disasters. When it's a hurricane or tornado or mudslide, we tend to seek shelter, sort of a crawl into our shell. However, with wildfire, we seem to get on our Ninja Turtle. And again, that tends to result in bad results. So really, wildfire should be over here with the other natural disasters and leave the firefighting for the firefighters. We tend to lose more individuals in grass and brush fires as opposed to forest fires. You can see the flame intensity, flame lengths on this grass fire. Prescribed fire outside of Santa Rosa a few years ago. This is a picture of taken up on the hill. You see the head fire coming across this pasture. In a short order, you have the flank fire and the back fire and the head fire all sucking together to create a pretty intense environment. And again, smoke is sort of the great equalizer. It's very difficult to operate when there's that much smoke. I included this slide to remind us or to illustrate, again, the challenges of even in short grass, the fire behavior we can find there. These nonograms of old, in this case, show this icon indicates what would be effective under these fire conditions. In other words, a hand crew. As you move up the response curve, a bulldozer, so mechanical equipment. Again, this is short grass for low wind speeds. Keep the same short grass, but move to high wind speeds. Now look at the response curve. The majority of the response curve is well above even where the bulldozer is effective. So just changing the wind speed, even though it's still short grass, renders outcomes, or in other words, fire behavior, that's just, quite frankly, deadly. Okay, let's go to situations that are unique to farms and ranches. Equipment. This picture shows, for example, oftentimes equipment we find on a farm or ranch. And I like the fact that these are parked away seemingly from the fuel source. We have grass that looks like it's been mowed. However, these vehicles are parked pretty close together. So sometimes these vehicles have grass buildup on them. And if an ember lands on one vehicle and ignites this vehicle, then you tend to get a vehicle-to-vehicle ignition. So create defensible space where equipment, fuel, and chemicals are stored. Try and store them about 30 feet apart from each other. You can use a weed eater, graze it, mow it, spray it. Even create a gravel pad to create a barrier for your equipment. Propane tanks. We're going to relocate those at least 30 feet from structures and create a 10-foot radius of non-combustible zone. Oops, that's the wrong picture. There we go. Certainly, if a propane tank goes off, right, it's going to be a pretty hot, intense environment. This shows a classic before and after of what you want to do. Maybe this is before. Here we have trees growing up around this propane tank and firewood stacked up. The understory isn't too bad. It looks like mostly bare ground. That's good. And so an after picture, we remove the tree and the firewood stacked up, and we have a safer environment for a propane tank. Even better, in this case, we see pavers underneath the pad, bare ground. This is a good example of what to chew for. And on the picture on the left, again, of course, that's clearly not desirable, whereas on the right, something more like that. Haystacks obviously can be quite the fire hazard. Again, we want to create defensible space around these haystacks, store them 30 to 100 feet apart. In other words, not in the same location. And again, you can use a weed eater, graze it, mow it, spray it. In this picture, we can see a strategy, right, where you sort of collect a certain number of hay bales, and then maybe the rest of your hay bales in another location. So that if this hay bale, this collection tends to go up in a fire, then maybe this one wouldn't. And also, again, create space between haystacks. This may or may not keep one set of haystacks, from lighting the other, but you get the idea. In this picture, we can see it's pretty good on three sides of the haystack. There's not much fuel to burn. It's essentially bare ground. It's been mowed, but for whatever reason, this spot right here would be vulnerable to fire or embers landing there and then transmitting heat and flames to the haystack. So simple solution, of course. Weed eater, graze it, mow it, spray it. Another option, many times on a farm and ranch, you have equipment that you could put out foam. And so this picture illustrates that just by covering this with foam, they would be able to withstand the heat and the flames and radiant heat from a pretty intense fire. Of course, once this becomes the situation, obviously it's a lost cause. It's very hard to put that out. Moving on to barns. Barns, sheds, outbuildings. We're going to create a 10-foot no fuel zone around the barn. This doesn't look like it's going to meet that. Utilize concrete walkways, gravel paths, bare soil, metal roof and siding. This isn't exactly a barn, but we can see that, again, the fuel load built up around this structure is going to leave it pretty vulnerable. This is better. Certainly there's not trees and shrubs, And it looks like the grass is pretty short. Of course, in the spring, you again probably want to weed eat around here, maybe even create some bare ground. If embers, being a wood siding, tend to land in or around this structure, it can still be vulnerable to fire, but at least direct flames and radiant heat probably won't be an issue. Now, although not very exciting, this would be the kind of what you want to shoot for. Metal roof, metal siding, tight ceiling doors, bare ground around the perimeter of the barn. Fuel breaks. Maintain and create fuel breaks around pastures. These should be about 15 feet wide. Now, oftentimes, it really depends on the wind and maybe the fuel type we're dealing with. The fire breaks can be effective, again, in some circumstances. If it's well, let's put it this way. If someone were welding or branding over here, and it was a 5 to 15 mile an hour wind day, and the fire either came backing across here, or even if it was a head fire, it would most likely stop here at this bare ground. Now, if it's blowing 25 miles an hour and there's a bunch of shrubs and fuel that's creating firebrands, it would certainly jump over that. But again, it does provide, on certain weather conditions, a fire break. This is probably not advisable. You can go on YouTube and find that video. But this gentleman, or this tractor, was able to get around that fire and at least stop it. Utilize prescribed fire. This is something I think we'd like to get more to, say in New Mexico, is using fire breaks, and you can burn off fire breaks, roads, cattle trails, wet line. It takes a little more work, but try to get ahead of those burn bans. But again, this is a unique tool that in the spring, you could go burn off that fuel that's just waiting to rip off on a red flag warning day. So again, utilize prescribed fire to create fire breaks and reduce fuel loads. Grazing to reduce blazing. Speaking of ranches, grazing and browsing options. Targeted grazing and browsing on areas around homes and other structures to reduce fuel loads. Rotational grazing can be useful. And consider pastures that are greater risk of fire, for example, near railroads or highways or open access. You can see the difference here, of course, right, between an ungrazed area and grazed. Obviously, there's less fuel here, shorter fuel heights. This is from a targeted grazing demonstration outside of Albuquerque a few years ago. Worked with horned locust remediation to achieve this in the high desert area. Ungrazed, this is some samples we took from that day. Ungrazed, we had 50 pounds per acre at 7.5 inches tall. And after the goats were done, we had 2.5 pounds per acre at 1.5 inches. So clearly, this would result in differences in fire behavior. All right, it's always good to have a livestock evacuation plan. Ensure proper registration and branding. That's always going to be important. Establish a contingency plan for burn forage. I have here a question mark, open gates and cut fences. It depends. Oftentimes you're running into a pasture with short, even moderate or tall grass under high wind events. That could put yourself in a pretty dangerous situation. So it really depends. It's a hard call to make. Sometimes it's hard to know where the fire is. It's very smoky and one can't tell. And we talked about it may seem far away, but then it spots out ahead and suddenly you're stuck there in the middle of your pasture with unburned fuel between you and the fire, and the wind's blowing 25, 30 miles an hour. That could be a dangerous situation. Also have a transportation plan. USDA offers a livestock indemnity program. You could investigate that, maybe through the Farm Service Agency. Again, documentation and paperwork will be required. This is a slide from our session 2, proactive steps, but the idea goes for farms and ranches as well. The idea is check with your agent each year, make sure you have the adequate insurance coverage. And in terms of farms and ranches, right, there's often riders that you can get that will cover livestock, forage, crops, and equipment, and so forth. It's useful to have maps on hand, property maps that are available for firefighters. Again, depending on the nature of the fire. whether or not you're there or maybe you've evacuated. But if you're there and you can provide a map that marks water tanks and other water resources, roads, paths, fences, so forth. Maybe provide them with gate keys, combination or lot combinations. And finally, again, in rural environments, you want to know multiple escape routes. So this is outside of Corona, and maybe if you lived on this seemingly one road in, one way in, one way out road out here on top of this mesa, you can use Google Earth. If you zoom in a little closer, you find out, oh, you know what, there's this 2-track over here, maybe on my neighbor's property that I could get out on. Maybe it's on a horseback or even walking or an ATV or side by side or driving. But the point is you want to, ahead of time, utilize whatever means you can, maps, Google Earth, talking to your neighbors, and find multiple evacuation strategies. You may even be walking off the side of this mesa if that's allowable. But again, on a red flag warning day, the fire can move pretty quick. All right, that was a quick cover of Preparing the Farm and Ranch. We have this publication. If you search Wildfire Preparing the Farm and Ranch, or E1048, you'll find that publication online with all that information and more. Feel free to call or email me with questions.